My DIL said she'd use my pension. That night, she opened the fridge and saw the truth. She thought I was old, soft, easy to drain. But that night, when she opened the fridge, the shelves were empty, except for one folded note. Still taped to the mustard jar, in my handwriting, "You counted on my contributions." I corrected the math. As the cold air hit her face, the silence said what I never would. That's when she realized I hadn't forgotten the withdrawals. I'd just finally started making some of my own. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Margaret placed the bowl of salad in the center of the dining table, the sharp, crisp greens almost mocking the calm stillness of the room. The air felt thick with the scent of garlic and balsamic vinegar, yet it clung to the space like something unresolved. Her hands moved with practiced grace, but her mind was already ahead of the words that would shatter this careful calm. She took a seat at the head of the table, the weight of years of decisions settling on her like a mantle. Jason sat at the far end, eyes focused on the glossy sheen of the wine glass in front of him. He was polite, as usual, but there was always an undercurrent of something else when the meal was over, an undercurrent that never quite reached the surface. Tessa took a sip from her glass, eyes flicking to the fresh greenery on the table. Her voice broke the silence, smooth and rehearsed. "When your pension kicks in, we'll finally be able to upgrade the patio." Jason chuckled nervously, his gaze flickering toward Margaret, who remained unmoved, still folding her napkin with deliberate precision. Elena, her granddaughter, dropped her fork with a quiet clink. The sound hung in the air, an unspoken shift that seemed to radiate through the room. Margaret's eyes, sharp as ever, met Tessa's without a trace of the warmth that usually filled the space when they gathered. She didn't miss the way Tessa's hand tightened around her glass, or how Jason shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Did you say we?" Margaret's voice was calm, yet threaded with an undercurrent that made it impossible to ignore. Tessa didn't even pause, her smile widening with that practiced ease. "Of course. We're one household now." There it was. The slip. The assumption. Tessa's declaration seemed too comfortable, too knowing. But it was not hers to claim. Margaret set her napkin down slowly, folding it neatly before leaning back in her chair. Her gaze, now cold and implacable, never wavered. "Interesting." Margaret's lips curled slightly, the ghost of a smile touching her eyes. "I hadn't deposited a cent here." A moment passed, the sound of Elena's silent breaths filling the space between them. Jason's face flushed crimson and his hand twitched on the table before him. He glanced at Tessa, but she only looked at Margaret with the same measured patience, as though Margaret had simply misheard. "Mom, you can't," Jason began, but his words stumbled, faltering in the face of his mother's unwavering calm. His voice was caught somewhere between defensiveness and uncertainty, a tightrope he'd walked for years but had never quite balanced on. Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached for the glass of water by her plate, taking a sip with the same measured grace she had always carried. When she finally spoke again, her tone was low, almost casual, as if she were discussing the weather rather than the unfolding rift between them. "Did you think it wasn't my pension? That I had simply forgotten about the years I spent in education?" Margaret's voice, sharp and deliberate, cut through the air. Tessa, who had begun to stir uncomfortably in her seat, quickly regained her composure, a tight smile playing at the edges of her lips. "It's not that, Margaret. I just thought, well, it's family. The house. The upgrades. It's just practical." Margaret's eyes narrowed. Practical. Practical. Like a well-measured step in a dance that only one person was leading. "No, Tessa," Margaret replied, her voice soft but weighted with the certainty that had shaped her entire life. "What you think is practical is precisely why I made sure you couldn't touch it." Elena shifted in her seat, her fork now forgotten. She watched the exchange, her face unreadable, though the tension between her mother and grandmother wasn't lost on her. Jason reached across the table, his hand hovering over Tessa's. He needed to act. He needed to control the damage before it spread. But Margaret wasn't finished. You've taken so much from me already. My patience, my time. But this, my hard-earned savings, it's not a we thing. It was always meant to be mine. And now I'm the one who's protecting it. Her words fell heavily into the silence that followed. Tessa's face shifted, her eyes flashing with something between anger and disbelief. Jason sat back, his expression clouded, torn between the need to defend his wife and the quiet realization that his mother had drawn a line that he could no longer ignore. Margaret leaned forward now, her eyes steady as she locked onto her son's. So no, there is no we. The room felt colder now, the weight of the truth settling between them like an unsolvable equation. The quiet tension in the air, thick and suffocating, told Margaret everything she needed to know. It wasn't just about money. It never had been. She stood up from the table without another word, her footsteps steady on the hardwood floor. Elena stood too, her chair scraping back with a sound far louder than intended. Margaret didn't turn to look at them again, but her voice rang out with finality as she reached the kitchen. Dinner's on the table. You'll figure out the rest. The door to the kitchen clicked closed behind her, leaving Jason and Tessa in the silence, each now fully aware that nothing would ever be the same again. Margaret sat in the dim light of her study, the clock ticking quietly on the wall, its hands moving in slow, deliberate precision. Her fingers moved over the keyboard with a calm that belied the storm brewing inside her. She wasn't one for surprises, least of all those of this magnitude. Her eyes narrowed as the account history loaded before her, each line a fresh reminder of how far things had gone without her consent. Derek had done his part. With a few keystrokes and his usual efficiency, he'd frozen the outgoing access to her pension-linked accounts, transferring the balance to a private fund under her sole trust. There was a neat, almost clinical finality to his email. All accounts rerouted, no further transfers pending. Margaret's gaze didn't leave the screen as she scrolled through the transaction history. Her fingers froze on the mouse as she saw it. An automatic transfer request, made by Jason, without her approval. The sum was significant. Enough to make a change, enough to confirm what she'd known, but hadn't dared voice. He had been testing the waters, making moves before she'd even known the game had started. Her heart didn't race. It didn't even skip a beat. Instead, there was a cold, calculating clarity in her chest, a knowing that had been there for years, waiting to surface. This wasn't the first time Jason had attempted to bypass her, but it would be the last. Her hand hovered over the phone, but she didn't dial. Instead, she set it back down with a quiet click, steadying herself. The weight of the moment was heavier than she had anticipated, but it was not a weight that threatened her. It simply anchored her, grounding her in the quiet truth of what was hers. Her life, her decisions, her money. The mere thought of handing it over, as if it were never hers to begin with, sparked something inside her. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was a promise that she would never let them rewrite her future. The soft creak of the door behind her made her turn. Delia stood in the doorway, a file in hand, her face impassive. Though Margaret saw the glint of something, a shared understanding, in her eyes. "You knew," Margaret said, the words more statement than question. Delia nodded and stepped into the room. "And this is why we keep paper records, not digital breadcrumbs." She dropped the file onto Margaret's desk with a soft thud, the sound grounding the air between them. The file was thick with details, legal forms, trust papers, each one confirming what had been set in motion long ago. Margaret reached for the file, but Delia's hand rested lightly on the cover, stopping her for a moment. "You didn't think they'd stop, did you?" Delia asked, her voice laced with the weariness of someone who had seen this all before. Margaret didn't answer right away. Instead, she opened the file, scanning the papers. There were the signatures, the trust documents, the power of attorney forms, updated and in order. It was all airtight. No holes, no loose ends. She had taken care of it long ago, but the weight of her decisions hadn't fully dawned on her until now. Delia was right. They wouldn't stop. And they had no intention of respecting the boundaries Margaret had set. Margaret's gaze fell on one paper in particular, a statement of trust. The final line clearly stating that no assets were to be accessed without the explicit consent of Margaret Halverson. She filed it carefully, tucking it away into her fireproof box in the closet. As much as she trusted Delia, as much as she trusted Derek, she wasn't going to take any chances. "Everything's in place," Margaret said softly, though her voice carried a strength that Delia could feel in her bones. "Now they'll see that it's never been about money. It's about control." Delia didn't say anything, just watched Margaret with quiet respect. She had seen this woman handle more than just financial matters. Margaret was a master at making the impossible seem inevitable. The quiet ping of an incoming email broke the stillness. Margaret glanced at the screen. It was Derek again. Confirmation. All accounts rerouted. Monthly disbursements set to new trust parameters. Files secured. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of the finality wash over her. Her pension, her legacy, was hers again. "Thank you," Margaret murmured, her voice barely audible as she reached for the file and tucked it into the drawer. Delia didn't respond, but her eyes softened. They both knew that this was just the beginning. The family would come for her. Perhaps in subtle ways. Perhaps with outright aggression. But they had no idea how far Margaret was willing to go to protect what was hers. And they wouldn't see it coming. As Delia turned to leave, Margaret's phone buzzed again, but she didn't check it. The game had changed. And this time, she wouldn't be the one left in the dark. Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, the silence of the room wrapping around her like a cocoon. When she opened them again, the weight of her resolve was heavier than ever. Her pension was no longer a tool for their control. It was a fortress. And they would never have access again. Tessa's fingers trembled slightly as she swiped the card again, her gaze fixed on the screen of the grocery store terminal. The soft beep that followed was uncomfortably final. She glanced up at the cashier. A young woman with too much lip gloss and an expression that was trying its best to appear neutral, but it was clear she had seen this before. Tessa's smile faltered, her hand tightening around the card as she slid it again. Another beep. Another refusal. "Sorry, ma'am," the cashier said, sounding almost too sorry, but not enough to make a difference. "It looks like the transaction's been declined." Tessa's mouth went dry. Her heart began to pound, the subtle beat of unease turning into something sharper, more insistent. She glanced at the items in her cart. An array of organic products, quinoa, almond milk, a few fresh vegetables, all the things she had told herself she needed for the week. A splurge, really. But she deserved it. She worked hard, after all. "Is there a problem with your bank?" the cashier asked. Her tone polite, but clearly suggesting this wasn't the first time someone had to deal with this kind of situation. Tessa bit her lip, a flush creeping up her neck. "I'll just try another card." The second card was rejected just as quickly. Her skin prickled with a sudden rush of heat, a flush creeping up from her chest to her face. She forced a smile, grabbing her wallet and stuffing it back into her bag, with a little more force than necessary. "Sorry about this. I'll take care of it," she muttered, turning away before the cashier could offer any further assistance. The walk back to the car felt like miles. She couldn't quite place the growing sense of unease that clung to her. As she slid into the driver's seat, the air conditioning suddenly felt too cold. Her hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles whitening. She pulled out her phone, her mind racing with the one thing she didn't want to think about. She tapped Jason's number. Jason was sitting on the couch at home, flipping through some TV show he wasn't really watching, when the ping of his phone broke his distraction. He glanced at the message, a frown immediately forming on his face as he saw the words. Tessa's name popped up on the screen. "Did your mom cancel something?" it read. His fingers hovered over the keyboard as he stared at the text. His first instinct was to pick up the phone and call her, but a deeper, more immediate sense of panic set in. Had Margaret done something to their account? He hadn't even thought about it since their last conversation. But this was different. He quickly typed back a response, trying to sound casual, though his heart was hammering in his chest. "No idea. I'll ask." Without waiting, he sent a quick message to his mother. "Mom, is there a glitch in your bank account?" Seconds stretched into minutes. His gaze flicked back to the TV, but it wasn't really there anymore. His thoughts circled, finding 1,000 explanations for the sudden failure of the card. A problem, maybe. A delay in processing. Perhaps it was nothing. But why hadn't she told him about any changes? His phone buzzed again. No glitch, just updates. He read the message, his stomach dropping as the words sunk in. Just updates. No explanation, no apology, just the briefest of responses. He stared at it for a long moment, uncertainty creeping into his mind. He didn't like the tone of it. This wasn't just a glitch. This felt deliberate. Tessa rushed in through the front door moments later, her steps quick, almost panicked. She threw her keys onto the counter, her voice tight as she confronted Jason, the words pouring out before she could stop them. "Jason, why did your mom cancel something? Why are we being locked out of the account? This is ridiculous." Jason, still holding his phone, turned to face her, the frown deepening. He hadn't expected this level of frustration, but it didn't surprise him. Tessa was nothing if not direct when things didn't go her way. He raised his hands, trying to calm her down. "I'm not sure, Tessa. I just messaged her. I'll figure it out." Tessa's eyes were wild, her lips pressed into a thin, angry line. "This is insane. We can't even buy food without having to explain ourselves." She threw her hands up, the tension in her body palpable. Jason opened his mouth to respond but was cut off by another ping from his phone. His eyes flicked down again, the sense of dread increasing as the new message from his mother flashed on the screen. There it was. External trust removed. The words sat there like a heavy stone in his chest. He read them again, his mind racing to make sense of it. The external trust removed. His stomach twisted as the implications settled in. Her pension. The money they had relied on, the money they thought they had access to, was now locked away. Tessa's voice pulled him back from the haze. "What's it say? What did she do?" Her voice was sharp now, panic creeping in as she leaned over his shoulder. Jason looked at the phone again, but the words had already taken root. "It's gone. She's locked it. We're shut out." Upstairs, in her room, Elena stood by the window, watching the exchange below. Her phone buzzed in her pocket and she pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw the message from her grandmother. "Are you okay?" She stared at the words for a long moment. The tension was thick downstairs, but Elena could sense something else. A change. Something deeper than the anger and frustration. Her grandmother's words were a lifeline in the storm. Elena typed a quick response. "I'm okay, Grandma, just watching. Don't worry." But the truth was, Elena wasn't sure if she was okay. She wasn't sure if any of them were. And soon, it would all come crashing down. The quiet hum of the conference room contrasted sharply with the flicker of Margaret's thoughts. She sat at the polished wooden table, her fingers loosely clasped in front of her. Her eyes focused on the woman across from her. Nora Hanley, the director of the pantry project, shuffled papers in front of her with a professional ease that made Margaret think she'd been doing this for years. "We'll split the donation just as we discussed," Nora said, her voice calm but tinged with a genuine warmth. "Half will go toward your future housing fund here, and half will be allocated to the hunger relief efforts we've outlined." Margaret nodded, her expression unreadable. It had taken all of 10 minutes to confirm the terms, a balance between her own future and the cause she cared about. One that didn't involve a penny of the money they expected her to give them. No more trust funds, no more waiting for someone else's approval. She was finally in control. "I understand the logistics," Margaret said, "but I need you to confirm that this won't be diverted or reallocated. I want no interference. This is my decision." Nora smiled, though there was an edge of respect in her gaze. "I understand, Margaret. We've made it very clear. Your donation will go exactly where you've outlined. And if you're ready, we'll begin the transfer right away." Margaret's mind flashed back to the dinner the night before. The cold, calculated exchange. The way Jason and Tessa had tried to take control. But now they would see how little influence they truly had. She wasn't just safeguarding her future. She was taking back the power. With a steady hand, Margaret reached for the pen and signed the final papers, her name flowing smoothly across the page, each letter a commitment to herself. She slid the papers back across the table toward Nora, her decision final. "They'll never forgive you for choosing strangers," Delia's voice echoed in her mind. Margaret didn't flinch. She'd heard it before, from Delia herself, the warning, the reminder that nothing would go unnoticed. That family would lash out. But Margaret didn't fear their anger anymore. She was done with their expectations. "Strangers didn't try to steal from me," Margaret replied, her voice quiet but resolute. Nora's smile deepened, a touch of admiration in her eyes. She respected Margaret's fortitude. But Margaret wasn't interested in admiration. She wasn't even interested in thanks. This was about something bigger than all of them. This was about showing them that she would never, ever be taken for granted again. The next day, a small press release was issued under the Pantry Project's banner. It was short, clean, and matter-of-fact, announcing Margaret Halverson as a major donor to the hunger relief efforts, a name on the list of philanthropists, those with the means to give, who chose to do something that mattered. There was no fanfare, no grand announcement. But in the quiet corners of Boulder, people began to talk. By noon, Tessa's Pilates instructor, a woman who had always seemed too busy to pay attention to much outside the yoga studio, was the first to mention it. "You know, I just saw the latest from the Pantry Project," she said, adjusting her ponytail as she spoke, clearly pleased with the gossip she was about to drop. "They're talking about some big donation from a Margaret Halverson, the one who just moved into that fancy retirement place, Violet Hill. Seems she's splitting her pension between that and hunger relief. Impressive, right?" Tessa's stomach turned as she processed the words. Her gaze flicked to the instructor, and she forced a tight smile. "Really? That's quite something." The instructor smiled, oblivious to the tension bubbling beneath the surface. "Yeah, they said she's really making a difference. You should check it out." As the instructor continued her stretching routine, Tessa stood still, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't remember the last time she had been this angry. She couldn't even think straight. She'd thought it was a mistake. She'd assumed Margaret was just too old to keep track of her finances. But this? No. This was deliberate. Margaret had taken everything. Her money, her control, and now this. She was making a statement. Tessa's hands clenched at her sides. She tried to push the frustration back. Tried to keep her face neutral, but it was useless. Everything had shifted. The world she thought she could control, the one that she and Jason had always moved through so effortlessly, was crumbling around her. By the time she got home, Jason was sitting in the living room, his face set in a grim line. He didn't even need to say anything. Tessa could see the flicker of shock in his eyes. He had seen the press release too. Tessa didn't wait for him to speak. She flung her purse onto the table and crossed the room in 2 long strides. "What the hell is she playing at, Jason?" Jason looked at her, his mouth a thin line. "I don't know," he said, his voice low. "But this is bigger than we thought." "Bigger than we thought," Tessa snapped. "She's made it public. She's turned her pension into a goddamn charity, and we're locked out." Locked out. Her voice was a dangerous whisper now, a calm before the storm. Jason stood, pacing toward the window. "She's trying to teach us a lesson. She wants us to see how easily we've taken advantage of her." Tessa's breath hitched, the weight of his words sinking into her chest. "And we'll show her that it's not over yet. This isn't the end, Jason. It's just the beginning." Jason turned, his eyes hardening. "I know. But she's not backing down. And neither can we." Elena stood at the top of the stairs, overhearing the growing tension from below. Her fingers traced the edges of the railing as she listened to her mother's angry voice, the bitterness curling into every word. They don't understand, Elena thought. They can't see that Grandma's doing this for herself, not for anyone else. Elena's phone buzzed, and she glanced down to see another message from Margaret. "Thank you for believing in me. This is my peace now." Elena pressed the phone against her chest. The world her parents had built was crumbling, and Margaret was standing tall in the center of it all, holding her ground. The storm was coming, and this time, Elena wasn't going to let it sweep her away. Jason unfolded the letter slowly, his fingers lingering over the official seal as if he could delay the inevitable. His voice was tight as he read aloud, his eyes scanning the words in disbelief. "Dear Ms. Halverson," he began, his tone stiff, "we are pleased to confirm your upcoming move-in to Violet Hill Senior Living Community. Your reservation is now secured, and your move-in date is scheduled for 2 weeks from today. We look forward to welcoming you to your new home." He let the paper drop onto the kitchen table, his gaze rising to meet Tessa's, who stood by the counter, arms crossed, her face a mask of frustration. "I thought we agreed you'd stay with us," he muttered, his words strained with something between disappointment and anger. Margaret stood in the doorway, her hands still resting on the sides of the chair she had just pushed back from. She didn't flinch at the accusation. The silence between them felt charged, as though each word was a negotiation, each breath a reminder of everything that had changed. "I don't recall a vote," she replied calmly, her voice as measured as ever, betraying none of the emotion that Jason's tone had stirred in him. Tessa's eyes narrowed, her lips pressed together in a thin line. "This is ridiculous, Margaret. You're isolating yourself. You're cutting us out. You know how much we've done for you, how much we've—" "No, Tessa," Margaret interrupted, her smile sharp but not unkind. "I'm protecting my peace. Isolation is something else entirely." There it was, that word again, peace. The one thing Tessa seemed unable to grasp. It wasn't the absence of people, not really. It was the absence of expectation. Margaret had long been trapped by others' needs, their demands, and their sense of entitlement. But no more. The room felt too small for the conversation unfolding within it. Jason's face had gone pale, his jaw clenched tightly. He looked at Margaret as though trying to reconcile the mother he'd known with this woman standing before him, calm, unshaken, and in control. "Mom, this isn't just about a place to live. You can't just walk away from us like this." Jason's voice cracked slightly, betraying the rawness that had always been there beneath the surface. "We're your family." "And this is my family now," Margaret said, her voice soft but final. "I've worked for this. I've earned this. and I don't owe anyone an explanation. Tessa stepped forward, her tone rising now, a mixture of desperation and anger. So what? You're just going to leave? After everything we've done? This is how you repay us? Margaret's gaze never wavered, her shoulders relaxed, unfazed by the accusations. What you don't understand, Tessa, is that I'm not leaving you. I'm simply choosing to live for myself. You haven't stolen anything that matters. Jason opened his mouth to protest but stopped, his words caught in his throat. Margaret could see it in his eyes, the frustration, the guilt, the betrayal. But there was something else there too, a quiet acknowledgement of the truth that was beginning to take shape in his mind. Elena's voice broke through the tension, soft but clear from the doorway where she had been standing, unnoticed until now. "Grandma?" she asked quietly, her words almost tentative. "Can I visit?" Margaret's expression softened, the weight of the moment lifting just slightly. She crossed the room toward Elena, her granddaughter's question an unexpected balm. "Always," she said, her voice gentler now. She reached out, brushing Elena's hair from her face with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the bond between them. Tessa's shoulders stiffened, the words hanging heavy in the air. It was a simple thing, Elena's request, but it was the one thing Tessa had not expected. There was a shift, a rupture in the way things had always been, and it was Elena who, in the quietest way, had just broken through the wall. Jason exhaled slowly, glancing between Margaret and Elena. His gaze fell again to the letter on the table, the finality of the words in front of him sinking in. He felt the walls of his world closing in, the edges blurring. His mother was moving on, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. "Are you really sure about this?" Jason asked, his voice a little more subdued now, though still laced with uncertainty. "You've spent your life here, your whole family. We're here." "I'm not sure you ever really saw me, Jason," Margaret said, her voice low and steady, like a wave rolling toward the shore, inevitable. "I've given everything for you, for this family, but what's left? A life spent fulfilling other people's needs? No. I've spent my years working, making sure everyone was happy. Now it's my turn." Delia, who had been quietly observing from the threshold of the kitchen, stepped into the room, her presence a steadying force. She wasn't surprised by any of this. She had helped Margaret prepare for it all. But she knew how hard it was for Jason, for Tessa, to see the woman they thought they knew become someone entirely different. "I've prepared the legal documents, Margaret," Delia said quietly, her voice warm but businesslike. "The trust is in place. Everything is ready. Your exit plan is secure." Margaret nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Jason's. "Thank you, Delia," she said simply, acknowledging the support that had quietly guided her through this entire process. The weight of the legalities, the complexity of her decisions, they had all been carefully planned, but they were more than just paperwork now. Jason's shoulders slumped. He didn't know how to fight this. There was no argument left, no leverage. The truth was, Margaret was already free. "I don't know what to say," he muttered, a bitter edge creeping into his voice again. "I can't even understand why you're doing this." Margaret's lips curled into a small, sad smile. "You don't need to, Jason. You never will. But I'm not asking for your approval anymore. I'm living for myself now." The silence in the room felt absolute, thick with years of unspoken words, unexpressed emotions. The rift between them was deep, too deep for anything to bridge. Margaret knew this, had known it for a long time, and as she stood there, her feet firmly planted in the life she was building for herself, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in decades. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Not by a long shot. Tessa's footsteps echoed in the hallway as she made her way to the kitchen, the scent of the evening's dinner still lingering in the air. She had barely said a word to Jason since their conversation earlier. The tension between them was palpable, a silent storm that refused to subside. She wasn't used to feeling this way, so small, so helpless. And certainly not when it came to her house. She pulled open the refrigerator door with a sharp tug, expecting to find the usual array of items: vegetables, condiments, some leftovers from the night before. Instead, she froze, her hand still gripping the handle. The fridge was nearly empty. There were a few stray bottles of almond milk, a jar of mustard, a wilted head of lettuce, and, beneath them, a folded note, neatly placed atop a shelf that should have been filled with food. Her breath hitched. She leaned forward, pulling the note from its place with a trembling hand. She unfolded it slowly, the paper crisp under her fingers. As she read the words, her heart skipped a beat. "You counted on my contributions. I corrected the math." Her throat tightened, a wave of disbelief washing over her. She could feel the sharpness of Margaret's words cutting through the air, the finality of them sinking into her chest. It wasn't just a note. It was a message, a statement, a declaration of what Margaret had done and what Tessa had failed to understand. This was more than just money. This was about control, power, boundaries. Tessa's pulse quickened, the heat in her chest rising. She slammed the fridge door shut with an anger she could no longer suppress. She stood there for a long moment, staring at the kitchen counter, her mind whirring with 1,000 thoughts. How could she have let this happen? How could they have been so blind to the fact that Margaret was already planning this, already preparing for the day when they would finally push her too far? "Mom!" Jason's voice shattered her thoughts. She turned just in time to see him storming up the stairs, his face flushed with frustration. He was headed to Margaret's room. Tessa followed close behind, her breath shallow, her heart thumping with a mixture of anger and fear. She knew exactly what was happening. Jason wasn't just upset anymore. He was panicked. He was seeing the reality of the situation, and he wasn't sure how to fight it. When they reached Margaret's room, Jason pushed the door open without knocking, the creak of it echoing through the silence. Margaret was sitting at her desk, calmly packing 2 boxes, one for books, the other for papers. She didn't even look up as they entered. "Mom," Jason said, his voice tight, each word carrying the weight of his frustration. "What are you doing? You can't just leave like this." Margaret looked up slowly, her eyes steady, her expression as calm as ever. The calmness only made it worse. "Leaving entitlement to its own appetite," she replied, her voice smooth, almost matter-of-fact, as if she were commenting on the weather, not making a life-altering decision. Tessa stepped forward, her fists clenched at her sides. "This is insane, Margaret. You can't just walk away from us. You can't take everything we've worked for, everything we've done for you, and walk out the door like it's nothing." Margaret stood up, her movements slow and deliberate. "What you don't understand, Tessa, is that I've been giving everything to you for so long that I've forgotten what it means to live for myself." She picked up the box, her hands steady. "You wanted the pension. I needed a boundary." Jason stood frozen in the doorway, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. "This is your family, Mom. This is where you belong. This is where you're supposed to be." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the vulnerability he hadn't shown in years. Margaret glanced at him, her gaze not unkind but unyielding. "This was never about where I belong. This was about where you thought I belonged. I've given you everything, Jason. But now, it's time for me." She turned back to the boxes, and Jason's gaze flickered to the stack of papers on her desk, the documents that had been prepared in silence, the legal steps she had taken without telling him. His stomach churned. This wasn't just about a house. This wasn't even about money anymore. This was about everything he thought he understood about his mother and what she was capable of. Tessa looked at him, her face twisted with frustration. "You're letting her do this. You're letting her push us out. And for what? Margaret's eyes met Tessa's now, her voice quiet but resolute. I'm not pushing anyone out, Tessa, but I am protecting myself. I won't apologize for that. There was a silence, thick with the weight of everything unspoken. Elena stood quietly in the hallway, watching the scene unfold, her hand resting on the door frame. She hadn't been seen, hadn't made a sound. She simply observed, and as she watched, something inside her shifted. She understood now. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the house. It wasn't about the pension. It was about freedom. For the first time, Elena realized that Margaret wasn't just leaving. She was reclaiming her life. I can't believe this, Tessa muttered under her breath, her words sharp, angry. But Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped forward into the room, her voice quiet but clear. Grandma, can I help? Margaret's gaze softened as she looked at Elena. Always. And just like that, the walls came down. Elena began to help, silently but with a determination that spoke volumes. No one else in the room spoke. But they all knew. Things had changed. The calm had broken, and the storm had only just begun. Tessa's eyes flicked from one person to the next, the tension rising again. She knew it wasn't over. Not yet. And the thought settled uneasily in her chest. She wasn't sure who would be left standing when the dust finally settled. The air in Boulder had turned crisp as the first hints of autumn began to settle over the city, but inside the sleek, sunlit lobby of Violet Hill, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. Margaret stood just inside the door, taking it all in. The polished floors, the soft hum of the elevator in the distance, and the muted chatter of residents who passed by in pairs, their faces kind but indifferent. This was where she would begin again. A woman in a navy blue uniform approached her, smiling. Ms. Halverson, welcome to Violet Hill. We're so happy to have you here. Margaret returned the smile, her voice steady, calm. Thank you. It's good to be here. The staff member led her down the hall, their footsteps light against the soft carpet. It felt surreal, like a dream unfolding. This wasn't just a new place to live. This was a clean slate. A place where no one had expectations, no one had a claim, and nothing was hers but what she had fought for. As they approached her apartment, Margaret's eyes took in every detail. The door was solid, understated, with a gold number etched in the corner. When it opened, she stepped inside, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she was alone. The apartment was exactly what she'd wanted. Light poured in from large windows, spilling across hardwood floors that gleamed under the soft afternoon sun. A comfortable sofa sat against one wall, a writing desk near the window where a fresh vase of flowers awaited her attention. The space was elegant, minimalist, yet warm, a perfect reflection of the life she was about to embrace. Margaret set her things down, feeling a deep sense of peace settle over her. She had worked for years, decades even, to build something for her family. And in return, she had been drained. She had given, given, and given. And in the end, it was only when she stopped that she realized how much she had sacrificed. This apartment, this life, was hers. And it was fully, unmistakably hers. Her eyes drifted to a framed photograph on the desk. A copy of her first paycheck, encased in glass. It was a symbol of everything she had built, a small, steady reminder of where she'd come from. The ink on that paycheck had faded, but the meaning behind it had only grown sharper with age. The people who had once relied on her were nowhere to be found in this space, and that felt freeing. There was a knock at the door. Margaret turned, and before she could even ask who it was, the door opened gently. Delia stepped in, a pie in one hand and a thick manila envelope in the other. "Thought you might need some comfort food?" she said with a wink, setting the pie on the counter before handing Margaret the envelope. Margaret accepted it, her fingers brushing against Delia's. She opened it, flipping through the contents. Inside was a stack of updated living wills, neatly organized. Margaret had expected nothing less from Delia, whose calm demeanor and meticulous nature had always made her the person Margaret trusted most with the logistics of her life. "Everything's in order," Delia said quietly, watching as Margaret scanned the papers. "You're fully protected, the trust is locked, and everything is in place for the future." Margaret nodded, her heart lightening with each confirmation. Delia's presence, her careful attention to detail, had made the transition smoother. It had made it possible for Margaret to move forward without hesitation. "I updated my emergency contacts," Margaret said, setting the papers aside. "Jason's off the list, of course. Elena's on it now." Delia didn't miss a beat. "Good choice." The room felt heavier now, the silence between them filled with things left unsaid. Margaret knew Delia understood the magnitude of the choice she'd made. It wasn't just about removing Jason's name from a list. It was about severing ties that had bound her for far too long, cutting through the threads of entitlement and expectation that had held her captive for years. There was a moment of quiet, and then Delia's voice broke through again. "What's next for you, Margaret? Now that the hard part's over?" Margaret stood at the window, looking out over the expanse of the city below. The view was beautiful, a patchwork of streets, rooftops, and the distant mountains that loomed like silent guardians on the horizon. "Now," Margaret said, her voice soft but unwavering, "I live. For me." The quiet ringing of a phone interrupted the moment. Margaret reached for it, her fingers cool as she glanced at the screen. It was an email from Derek, her financial advisor. She tapped it open, and her gaze flickered over the words. "Confirmation. Monthly pension disbursements are now set. One half directed to Violet Hill, the other to the Pantry Project. Both accounts are fully secured." Margaret exhaled slowly, a weight lifting from her shoulders. The choices had been made. The future was set. "You're all set, Margaret," Delia said, a knowing smile on her face as she watched her friend absorb the news. "Nothing left to do but live." Margaret stood there for a long moment, feeling a calmness wash over her that she hadn't known in years. She was free now. No more family obligations, no more secrets, no more pretending to be someone she wasn't for the sake of peace. But just as the feeling of victory settled in, she heard the sound of something, a knock at the door. Margaret's heart skipped a beat, a familiar weight settling in her chest. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The sun was low in the sky when Tessa sat across from her lawyer, the sterile smell of the office pressing in from all sides. The polished desk between them felt like a barrier, a symbol of everything she wanted to break through. She was tired of playing by the rules. Tired of trying to negotiate with a mother-in-law who had made it clear she was done being controlled. But the papers in front of her, thick with legal jargon, gave her hope. This was her last chance. "This is the one," Tessa said, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. "If we can get her declared unfit, just temporarily, it will give us time to sort this out. She's not in her right mind." Her lawyer, a tall, aloof man with a pinched expression, nodded, though his eyes were hard. "I'll need more than a hunch, Tessa. We're talking about a legal battle here. We need medical documentation. Something substantial." "I've got that covered," she said quickly. Her voice was sharp, eager. "I spoke to a few people who know her condition. She's not mentally stable. She's been acting out of character. You can argue that she doesn't have the cognitive ability to make these decisions." Her lawyer pushed the file forward. "I'll work with this, but it's risky. We'll need to prove that she's incapable, not just difficult." Tessa leaned forward, her voice lowered but full of venom. "This is about her ability. You don't understand. She's She's pushed us too far. She can't do this. She can't just take everything and walk away. The lawyer glanced at the papers again, his brow furrowing. We'll file it, but don't get your hopes up. This isn't a simple case. A few days later, the tension in the air seemed unbearable. Tessa was still stewing over the legal move, her mind focused entirely on the next step, not realizing the storm that was brewing outside her carefully controlled world. The phone rang at Derek's office, and his eyes narrowed as he saw the incoming email, the one from Paige, Margaret's estate lawyer. He clicked it open, a knot forming in his stomach as he scanned the response. Denied, and flagged. He leaned back in his chair, a bitter smile creeping across his face. Tessa's lawyer had tried. He'd sent the petition for the mental competency evaluation, along with all the medical notes and recommendations. But it wasn't going to work. Margaret had played her cards too well. Her defenses were in place, airtight. Derek hit the reply button, his fingers moving quickly over the keys. You're legally untouchable, Tessa. Whatever you're planning next, it won't work. Back at the house, Jason and Tessa sat in the living room, the weight of the email settling in. Jason held his phone in his hands, his gaze unfocused. He wasn't surprised. Not really. But the sense of helplessness, the realization that their plan had fallen apart, hit him harder than expected. We can't just let her get away with this, Tessa said, her voice edged with frustration. We need to find another way. Maybe we can still convince her. Maybe she'll change her mind if we... Her words trailed off as she met Jason's distant gaze. Jason's eyes were hollow, a quiet defeat echoing in his posture. She's not going to change her mind, Tessa. She's already made it clear. She's untouchable right now. Tessa's fingers dug into her palms. Then what do we do? She's already taken everything. What's left? Jason stood abruptly, his thoughts scattering, his voice rising in frustration. I don't know, but we're not just going to let her disappear without a fight. We can't. Tessa shook her head, the tension in her body growing tighter. If we can't touch her legally, then we'll do it emotionally. We'll freeze her out. Leave her with nothing but her own choices to rely on. Her eyes locked with Jason's, sharp and determined. She wants peace? We'll see how peaceful she is when she's isolated. Jason stared at her, a cold silence falling between them. The idea seemed too harsh, but it was the only card left to play. You're right. She'll learn. She'll regret making a move like this. Upstairs, Elena watched the scene unfold from the top of the staircase. Her phone buzzed quietly in her pocket, and she pulled it out, her gaze flickering over the text from her grandmother. Are you okay? Elena stared at the screen, the weight of everything heavy on her chest. She had been silent, had kept to herself, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire, but the longer she watched, the more she understood. The anger, the manipulation, the way her mother and Jason believed they were entitled to what Margaret had built. It was suffocating. And it was clear to her now. They had already pushed her grandmother too far. Elena typed her response slowly, her fingers hesitating for just a moment before she hit send. I'm okay, Grandma. Just watching. But in truth, Elena wasn't sure if she was okay. Watching her family crumble like this was becoming harder with each passing day. She wasn't sure what came next. But one thing was clear. Her grandmother was right. The storm was coming. And no one was ready for the aftermath. Not yet. Not by a long shot. The Sunday morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as Jason sipped his coffee. His eyes glazed over the pages of the newspaper. The headlines, something about the weather, the usual gossip about local businesses, meant nothing to him. But the page turned, and his fingers froze on the glossy print. There it was. The article, bold and unmissable, staring up at him like an accusation. Retired educator funds 10,000 meals after family fallout. Jason's heart tightened. a cold fury spreading through his chest. The headline was a punch in the gut, but it was the photo beneath it that stung the most. There, in full color, was his mother, Margaret, smiling with a group of volunteers, stocking shelves at a local food pantry. She looked content. More than content. She looked like she was exactly where she wanted to be. Margaret wasn't just helping out, she was leading. And in the background, behind the warm smiles of the volunteers, was the very thing Jason and Tessa had been trying to control: her legacy. Her pension wasn't being hoarded for them. It wasn't being used to fund their comfort. It was going to strangers. His pulse quickened. He didn't know why this felt like a betrayal. She had every right to do with her money what she pleased. But it felt personal. It felt like a slap in the face. Tessa's voice broke through the fog of his thoughts. She was standing in the doorway, her face pale, her fingers clutching the edge of the doorframe like she might fall. "What are you going to do about this?" she asked, her tone flat but edged with something darker. "She's making us look small." Jason didn't answer immediately. His eyes never left the article. The words blurred on the page as his fingers traced the outline of the photo, his frustration building. The anger was there, simmering, but beneath it was something far deeper: helplessness. They'd tried to stop her, but she wasn't backing down. Not even a little bit. He pushed the paper aside and grabbed the newspaper, crumpling it in his hands before tossing it into the recycling bin. "There's nothing more to do," he muttered. The finality in his voice was almost hollow. Tessa stepped forward, her gaze hardening. "I thought she was tired. I thought she was ready to fade away. But she's been planning. All this time, she's been planning. We didn't even see it coming." Jason stood up abruptly, his chair scraping across the floor. His frustration, his anger, it all bubbled to the surface in that single moment. She was never going to stop, Tessa. Not until she had everything in place. This was never about money. It was about control. She wanted to take everything back. And she has. Tessa folded her arms across her chest, her eyes narrowing as she watched him. "You think this is the end? She's making a mockery of us. The whole town will see it. People will know she gave away everything we thought we could control. She's embarrassing us." Jason didn't know how to respond. He had been angry, yes. But now, more than anything, he felt lost. They'd lost the fight. The war wasn't even close. Across town, in the quiet solitude of her new apartment, Elena sat on her bed, flipping through the pages of the same Sunday paper. The headline stood out to her, but it wasn't the shock or the bitterness she felt when she saw it. It was something different. Pride. There was something almost gentle about seeing her grandmother, surrounded by people, contributing in a way that only she could. The photo of Margaret beaming with the volunteers hung in the air, its warmth undeniable. She was giving back. She wasn't just surviving her family's fallout, she was thriving. Elena read through the article slowly, the words catching her attention more than the pictures. Margaret wasn't just donating money. She was putting her time, her presence into something that mattered. She wasn't apologizing for taking a stand. She was helping the very people who needed it most. The contrast between what her family had expected and what Margaret had done was a bitter pill. But it wasn't the bitterness that stayed with Elena. It was the clarity. She had always thought that her family's expectations were the weight that Margaret couldn't escape from. But here, in these pages, she saw the truth. Margaret had fought for years to build a life of meaning, and now, in her own way, she was showing Elena what it meant to reclaim it. Elena reached over to her desk, grabbing a pair of scissors. She cut out the article, carefully trimming the edges. She didn't pause to think about it. She just did it. And as she tacked it onto her dorm wall, right next to her bed, she realized she wasn't doing it just to honor Margaret. She was doing it to remind herself. She wasn't going to let herself be pulled into the drama, the manipulation. She would be different, stronger. Her grandmother had made her choices. It was time for Elena to make hers. Back at Violet Hill, Margaret stood at her desk, staring out the window. The weight of the day's events settled into her bones, but she didn't feel the need to hurry or rush. She didn't need approval. Delia entered quietly, carrying a cup of tea, and placed it gently on the desk beside Margaret. "You're becoming harder to forget," Delia said, her voice warm and knowing. Margaret smiled softly, taking a sip of the tea. "I stopped trying to be remembered," she replied, her voice quiet but resolute. The truth of her words rang in the stillness of the room. She no longer needed validation from her family, from anyone. She had found something better. Peace. The door to Loam Cafe chimed softly as Margaret stepped inside, the familiar scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods filling the air. The space was cozy, warm, and unpretentious, a haven from the outside world, where the noise of her past life could no longer reach her. Margaret paused for a moment, taking in the soft hum of conversation and the casual clatter of plates. For the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her decisions lift. Here, in this small, quiet cafe, she could finally exhale. Elena was already seated at a table by the window, a half-finished cup of tea in front of her. She glanced up as Margaret approached, her face softening with a smile. There was no tension between them, no unspoken words hanging in the air. Just the ease of being together in a place where time seemed to slow down. Margaret slid into the chair across from her, the sunlight catching the edges of her silver hair, making her look more serene than she'd felt in years. "I didn't think you'd be up so early," she remarked, her tone light, though there was a warmth in her voice that hadn't been there when they'd last spoken face to face. Elena shrugged, her eyes sparkling. "I like coming here. It's quiet, and I think you might have been right about needing some space away from everything." Margaret nodded slowly, her gaze drifting to the menu on the table, though she didn't need to look. The cafe had become a sanctuary for both of them, a place where they could simply exist without the shadows of family drama hanging over them. They both knew that their lives had irrevocably changed, but in this moment it was just the two of them, the world outside forgotten. A waitress approached, and Elena ordered a slice of pie to share, apple, with a crumbly topping, and a fresh pot of tea. As the waitress moved away, the silence between them grew comfortable, familiar. Finally, it was Elena who broke it, her voice hesitant but steady. "Mom says you betrayed us." Margaret's hand stilled, the quiet clink of silverware on porcelain filling the space for a brief moment before she set her napkin down and looked Elena in the eyes. Her expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable resolve in her gaze. "She mistook me for an account, not a person." Elena's brow furrowed slightly, her gaze softening. "I don't understand. You gave her everything. You gave us everything." "I did," Margaret replied, her voice measured, steady. "But at some point I had to stop being everything for everyone else, and when I finally stopped, well, it became clear that I wasn't seen for who I really am." Elena didn't say anything for a moment, her fingers tapping the edge of her cup as she processed her grandmother's words. "But you never yelled," she said, her voice quieter now. "Not once. Not even when you had every right to." Margaret smiled faintly, a touch of sadness in her eyes. Some truths don't need volume, just signatures. She leaned back in her chair, her hands folding neatly in front of her. "I didn't need to yell. I just needed to stop giving." Elena looked at her, eyes wide with a kind of understanding that had taken her a long time to reach. "It must have been hard," she said softly. "It was," Margaret admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "But the hardest part wasn't the giving. It was realizing how much of me I had lost in the process." The pie arrived in front of them, and the warmth of the cinnamon and apples filled the space between them. Margaret picked up her fork, cutting into the soft crust, savoring the first bite. It wasn't just the sweetness of the pie that comforted her. It was the simple act of sharing it with Elena, of taking a moment to enjoy something without guilt or obligation. They ate in silence for a while, the easy rhythm of their conversation picking up again as Elena told stories about her friends at school, about her studies, about how she was adjusting to her new life. It was the kind of conversation Margaret had longed for, a conversation that wasn't laced with expectations, anger, or frustration, just connection. When the last of the pie was gone, Elena reached for her wallet, pulling out a few bills to pay the bill. Margaret's hand stopped her. "No, I'll get this," she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She reached for her purse and pulled out a checkbook, the pen poised in her hand. Elena hesitated, then smiled, the hesitation slipping away. "I thought you didn't believe in saving?" Margaret laughed softly, the sound warm and genuine. "I believe in giving when it counts." She wrote the check slowly, her handwriting neat and deliberate. When she slid it across the table to Elena, the gesture was simple but loaded with meaning. "This is for college," Margaret said, her voice quiet. "No strings." Elena blinked, the shock evident on her face as she reached for the check, her fingers trembling slightly. "Grandma, you didn't have to do this. You've already given so much." Margaret looked at her, the gentleness in her eyes softening her features. "I want to give you the chance to live for yourself, Elena. Not for me, not for anyone else. Just for you." Elena's eyes filled with a mix of emotions, gratitude, love, and something deeper. A promise to herself, to her grandmother, to live a life defined by her own choices. She tucked the check carefully into her purse, her voice steady. "I'll make sure it counts. I'll make it count, Grandma." Margaret nodded, her heart swelling with quiet pride. In this small cafe, with a shared meal and an unexpected gift, she had done what she had set out to do. She had given Elena the space to stand on her own, free from the weight of the past. For the first time, Margaret knew her decisions had been the right ones, and as the day carried on, neither of them spoke of the past. Instead, they simply moved forward, together, one quiet moment at a time. Margaret was kneeling in the community garden at Violet Hill, her hands carefully planting pansies in neat rows. The rich, earthy scent of the soil filled the air, the steady rhythm of her movements a quiet meditation after the chaos of the past few months. The world felt softer here, between the rows of flowers and the distant hum of activity from the community center. It was her sanctuary, a space that felt entirely hers, untouched by the demands of family or the expectations they had once imposed. Her peace, however, was short-lived. She heard footsteps approaching, hesitant but unmistakable. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Jason stood a few feet away, his posture stiff, his hands clutching a bundle of old bank printouts, crumpled at the edges as though he had been holding onto them too tightly. His face was pale, drawn with a mix of frustration and guilt. Margaret straightened slowly, dusting off her hands on the knees of her slacks. She didn't say anything, merely waiting for him to speak, knowing that whatever words came next would mark the point of no return. "Mom." Jason's voice was tight, strained. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" He stepped closer, holding the papers out between them, his eyes never quite meeting hers. This is all of it. I don't understand. Why didn't you tell me what you were doing?" Margaret took a breath, her gaze fixed on the printouts for a moment before she met his eyes. The vulnerability in his face made her stomach twist, but she didn't let it show. She had spent years trying to protect him from the consequences of his actions, but it was clear now that he was only just starting to see the truth. You didn't ask, Margaret said, her voice steady. You just expected. Jason's mouth tightened, and he dropped his gaze to the papers. His fingers shook as he fidgeted with the edges, as if trying to make sense of the mess before him. I never expected you to shut me out like this. All of this time, you've been hiding things from me. From all of us. Margaret could see the frustration building in him, but the words she had been waiting for came next, cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. I didn't know what you were doing. I didn't know you were freeing yourself like this. Jason's voice cracked, the weight of his admission heavy in the air. You could have trusted me. Margaret took a step toward him, her expression soft, but unwavering. Jason, trust isn't given. It's earned. She paused, letting the words hang between them. You were more interested in what I could give you than in who I was. Jason opened his mouth to speak, but the words faltered on his tongue. Instead, he looked down at the papers in his hands, his jaw tightening. I didn't think it was like this. I didn't see it coming. Margaret exhaled slowly, taking a small step back, allowing him space. She motioned toward a bench nearby, a simple wooden seat, and gestured for him to sit. She joined him, the weight of the conversation settling between them. The trust, she began softly, her eyes scanning the peaceful garden in front of them as though searching for the right words, was something I set up a long time ago. I didn't do it for you, Jason. I did it for me, for my future, and for Elena's. Jason's head jerked up. Elena, you're giving her all of it? Margaret's gaze softened as she looked at her son, his expression one of confusion and frustration. No, Jason. It's not all about the money, it never was. You and Tessa assumed that, but it's not. I built a life that was mine, and when I saw that you were no longer seeing me, just my resources, I made sure you couldn't take them from me. Not anymore. Jason's face flushed, the guilt and realization flashing in his eyes. The withdrawals, the freeze, that was you? Yes, Margaret replied quietly. I froze everything, and I rerouted it to where it needed to go. You had access, I trusted you, but you used it to control me, and I couldn't allow that anymore. Jason's chest rose and fell with each shallow breath. His hand clenched into a fist, then relaxed. He swallowed hard before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't see it. I didn't see how much I took from you. Margaret turned to him fully now, her gaze unwavering, but her heart a little lighter. Apology accepted, she said simply. Then her voice dropped a fraction, the finality settling into her words. Access isn't. The silence that followed was deep, laden with years of unspoken expectations, and now, the truth that had been revealed too late. Jason let out a heavy sigh, his shoulders slumped. The guilt he had carried for so long now washed over him, but there was no relief, no catharsis. Just the heavy burden of a realization he had never wanted to face. For a long while, neither of them spoke. The sound of birds in the trees, the rustling of leaves in the breeze, and the distant hum of Violet Hill's daily rhythm were the only sounds that filled the space between them. Finally, Jason spoke again, his voice small, almost broken. I didn't get it. Not until now. Margaret gave a small nod, the faintest of smiles playing at her lips. It's too late for regrets, Jason. But it's not too late for you to understand. Jason's eyes flickered with something close to understanding now, a recognition that had been long overdue. He leaned back against the bench, his head tilted slightly toward the sky, as if processing everything in a new light. He was quiet for a long time. I'll never be able to make it right, he said quietly, almost to himself. Margaret didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. She had done what she had to do. She had finally taken control of her life. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, almost tender. "It doesn't need to be made right, Jason. It just needs to be real." And with that, she stood up, smoothing her skirt, ready to leave him to his thoughts. The conversation had ended, but the journey was far from over. Jason stayed seated, his eyes distant as he watched her walk away. The weight of the past settling over him like a fog. He had no idea where this would lead, but he knew one thing for certain. He had seen the ledger, and it was closing. And for the first time, Jason wasn't sure where he fit anymore. Margaret sat at her desk, the letter in front of her, the words echoing in her mind long after she had read them. She had spent hours crafting this document, ensuring that every word was chosen carefully, each sentence a reflection of her resolve. The legal boundaries had been drawn. There was no room for negotiation, no room for further manipulation. Her decisions had been made, and now it was time for the world, her family, to accept them. She took a deep breath, the weight of the paper in her hands grounding her in the moment. Visitation welcome, finances closed. No access to pension, property, or residual trusts. All assets are now secure in the new trust established for Margaret Halverson's sole benefit and for charitable contributions in Elena's name. It was final. The months of tension, the years of giving, the sacrifices, everything had come to this. Jason and Tessa would have no claim to what she had worked for. The legacy she had built, the life she had fought to preserve, was hers, and hers alone. Margaret reached for the pen beside her, her fingers steady as she signed the document, the ink flowing smoothly across the page. Each stroke was a quiet declaration of her autonomy, each signature a line drawn between her past and her future. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in the envelope. The legalities were done. The lines had been drawn, and now there was no turning back. Later that afternoon, the silence of Violet Hill was shattered by the sound of a door slamming. Tessa's voice followed, loud and furious, carried through the hallways as she stormed into the living room, her face twisted in rage. Jason stood behind her, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. "Is this really happening?" Tessa spat, her voice thick with disbelief. "You're locking us out completely? You really think you can just cut us off and walk away like this?" Jason didn't say a word. His gaze was distant, his silence more telling than anything else. He had known this moment was coming, but now that it was here, he wasn't sure how to feel. He felt like a spectator in his own life, watching as his mother dismantled the last of the family ties. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching them. She had anticipated this confrontation, had known that the consequences of her actions would be heavy, but there was no fear in her heart now, only certainty. She had given them everything she could, and now it was time for her to reclaim what was hers. "You don't get to make the rules anymore, Margaret," Tessa shouted, her voice rising, wild with frustration. "You can't just do this to us. We're your family." Margaret remained calm, her posture upright, unyielding. "I've spent my life trying to be everything for you," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But I won't be used anymore. You've had your chance." Tessa's face flushed with rage, her fists clenched at her sides. "We've earned that money, Margaret. We've worked for it, and now you're taking it all away." "You haven't earned anything," Margaret replied, her gaze unwavering. "You never saw me. You saw an account, an opportunity, and I'm done being your resource." There was a long pause, the silence stretching between them like a chasm. Jason shifted uncomfortably, but he didn't speak. He had nothing left to say. Everything had already been said. And now, all he could do was watch as the family he had known slipped through his fingers. Margaret continued her charitable donations, each month sending a portion of her pension to the pantry project. She had set up a small, quiet fund in Elena's name, nothing extravagant, nothing showy, but enough to ensure that her granddaughter could pursue her dreams without the weight of family expectations holding her back. Elena had asked for nothing, and yet Margaret had given her everything. One afternoon, as she walked through the gardens of Violet Hill, she received a text from Elena. "Thank you, Grandma. You're giving me more than money. You're giving me memory." Margaret paused, her heart swelling as she read the message. Memory. The words struck her deeply. She had spent so much of her life trying to hold everything together, trying to build a legacy for her family, and yet it was the quiet moments like this that made all the difference. She typed a reply, her fingers slow but steady. "That's all I ever wanted to be worth." The words felt right. They were the truth she had spent years running from. But now, for the first time, she could accept them fully. She had given her family everything she could, and now, she was giving herself the peace she had been seeking all along. Later that evening, as Margaret sat at her desk, watching the sunset through the windows of her apartment, she heard the doorbell ring. She wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened the door, there stood Elena, her face lit up with a smile that made Margaret's heart flutter. "I thought I'd come by," Elena said, stepping inside, her arms open in a warm embrace. "I wanted to see you, to thank you, for everything." Margaret pulled her into a hug, feeling the weight of her granddaughter's words settle in her chest. She didn't need to say anything. She didn't need to explain. This was enough. As they pulled apart, Elena's eyes sparkled with a quiet understanding. "I get it now, Grandma. I understand what you've done for us." Margaret nodded, her gaze soft. "I did it for you, Elena. For your future." Elena smiled, her voice steady. "And I'll make sure it counts." Margaret felt the final threads of the past slip away, the weight of everything she had carried for so long finally lifting. She wasn't just handing over money or a legacy, she was handing over something much more valuable, the chance to live for themselves. And as Elena settled beside her, they both knew that the future was theirs to shape, no longer bound by the past. The world, for the first time, felt full of possibilities. Margaret stood in the middle of the food pantry, a slight smile tugging at her lips as she moved methodically to restock the shelves with canned goods. The hum of activity buzzed around her, volunteers sorting food, organizing donations, and filling boxes. It was her rhythm now, a far cry from the chaos she had left behind. The years of obligation to family, the years of giving without ever being seen for herself, had faded into the background of this quiet, fulfilling work. She was well into her routine when she heard the soft click of a camera shutter. Margaret didn't look up. She had agreed to this interview, yes, but the publicity still felt unfamiliar, unnatural. The photographer, a young man with a camera slung around his neck, approached her slowly, his voice gentle. "If I could get a shot of you here, restocking the shelves, it would help with the piece. Just like you're working, as usual," he suggested, his eyes scanning her movements, searching for a moment of grace. Margaret nodded without a word. She had never been one for grand gestures. Let them take the picture. Let them write their article. She had done this not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Still, the idea of her face plastered in print, shared with a broader audience, was a sharp contrast to the life she had built for herself here. But there was no turning back now. The article would be published the next day, and when it hit the press, it came with a punch. The headline read, "Retired Educator Funds 10,000 Meals After Family Fallout." It was simple, straightforward. But it was the paragraph that followed that captured the essence of Margaret's philosophy. "Pensions aren't inheritances," Margaret had said, her voice steady as she shared her truth with the reporter. "They're earned breaths. A pension should be something that lets you live, not something you hoard until someone else decides to take it." The words hung in the air like the crisp fall breeze. Margaret hadn't expected them to go viral. She hadn't expected them to resonate with so many. Yet, within hours, the piece was circulating in elder planning circles, retirement communities, and financial forums. The article wasn't just a story of a woman donating her pension. It was a testament to the power of reclaiming one's life from the shackles of expectation. Margaret wasn't just giving food or money. She was giving people the chance to see her as more than a resource to be used. Back at Violet Hill, the staff was buzzing with excitement. It wasn't just the piece itself. It was the ripple effect. A community event was swiftly organized in Margaret's honor. It was a gathering, a celebration of her contribution to the pantry, a recognition she hadn't asked for but had certainly earned. As she walked into the event space, her steps slow and deliberate, the faces that greeted her weren't just neighbors or strangers. These were people who had heard her words, who understood the kind of woman she was becoming. There was no pretense here, just sincerity. Delia, as always, was by her side, a quiet figure in the crowd, watching with a hint of pride. When Margaret approached her, Delia gave a soft chuckle, her voice low but knowing. "They wrote you off," Delia said, nodding toward the others in the room. "But you rewrote the will." Margaret's lips curled into a faint smile. "With footnotes," she replied, her voice calm but with an edge of quiet pride. The gathering was small but impactful. People came up to her, shared their gratitude, told her stories of how her actions had affected them. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the exposure. It was about the message she had sent. A woman who had been expected to live quietly, to fade into the background, was now a beacon of strength, of autonomy, of unapologetic defiance. The evening wore on, and though Margaret smiled and thanked people, her mind wandered to the bigger picture. It wasn't just about what she had given, it was about what she had taken back, her autonomy, her voice, and her future. She wasn't just a mother or a grandmother now. She was Margaret Halverson, and she was done being anyone's afterthought. As the evening came to a close, Margaret stood by the door, exchanging final pleasantries. Jason and Tessa had not shown up, and that was no surprise. They hadn't been able to accept her choices, and they never would. But as she stepped outside, the crisp air cool on her face, she realized something. They didn't need to understand her. They didn't need to approve. She had reclaimed her life, and that, in itself, was enough. Later that night, as she sat at her desk in her apartment, the weight of the evening's events settled into her bones. She reached for her phone, her fingers moving carefully over the screen. Elena's message from earlier that day was still there. "Thank you, Grandma. You're giving me more than money. You're giving me memory." Margaret typed a quick reply. "That's all I ever wanted to be worth." And as she hit send, she felt a quiet sense of peace wash over her. There was no more running, no more pretending. Margaret had finally become the woman she was always meant to be. And the rest? Well, that was up to them. The door to Margaret's guest suite at Violet Hill opened with a soft click, and Elena stepped inside, taking in the serene space with wide eyes. The room was bathed in soft light from the afternoon sun, the walls adorned with warm, calming hues, and the furniture arranged neatly in a way that felt both welcoming and effortlessly elegant. A sense of peace hung in the air, and Elena felt it immediately. This room, this entire apartment, was a reflection of everything her grandmother had fought for. It was hers. "Make yourself at home," Margaret said, her voice calm but warm as she stepped inside behind her. "I thought we could bake today, if you're in the mood. I've got some ingredients set out in the kitchen." Elena smiled, nodding as she moved further into the room, her gaze falling on the window seat where a book lay open, its pages weathered and well-loved. She'd spent enough time in the old house to know how much this place was a reflection of her grandmother's quiet strength. It wasn't ostentatious, but it was full of life, filled with careful touches of comfort. It wasn't just a room, it was a home. Margaret's eyes softened as she observed Elena. "It's been a long time since I've had someone to bake with. Your mom and Jason, well, they didn't really enjoy it. Too much of a hassle, I suppose." She chuckled softly as she moved toward the kitchen counter, her hands already moving to retrieve the bowls and flour. Elena followed her grandmother into the kitchen, where the smell of sugar and butter filled the air. There was something about baking with Margaret that felt easy, effortless. The old rhythm of measuring out ingredients, stirring, and laughing about silly little things created a bond that felt timeless. It wasn't just about the cookies. It was about sharing these simple moments together, ones that had been far too rare in the past few years. As they mixed the dough, their conversation naturally shifted toward more personal matters, away from the pleasant small talk. Elena paused, wiping her hands on a dish towel before speaking. "You're not bitter," she said, her voice soft, almost contemplative as she turned toward her grandmother, who was now shaping the dough into rounds with a practiced hand. Margaret smiled, her eyes sharp but kind. "I'm seasoned," she replied, her tone light, but there was a depth to it. "Bitter's a choice. I've learned to let go of things that don't serve me." Elena looked at her grandmother, studying her face for a moment. "I think you've let go of more than just things," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "You've let go of them." Margaret's smile softened. She didn't answer immediately, but the truth of her daughter and son's actions hovered like a cloud between them. Her decisions had caused pain, had caused rifts that might never be repaired. But she wasn't sorry for it, not anymore. The boundaries she had set were necessary, and the peace she had fought for was worth the cost. Elena shifted, suddenly more vulnerable. She paused in the middle of rolling out the dough, her expression serious now. "Mom said you'd leave nothing." Margaret's hands stilled, the familiar tension rising in the pit of her stomach. She hadn't expected Elena to mention it, not in this quiet, shared moment. The words that followed from her daughter, the judgment, the expectation, it stung even now. But she took a deep breath, her response steady. "She was right. To her," Margaret said simply, her voice calm but firm. "To her, I wasn't a person. I was a resource, an account to draw from." She thought that I owed her. Elena didn't speak for a moment. She looked at Margaret, the wheels turning in her mind as she processed her grandmother's words. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "You don't owe them anything, Grandma," she said softly, her voice filled with conviction. Margaret's heart swelled with pride, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she nodded, her hands moving back to the dough. "No, I don't. But I owe myself. And I owe you the chance to live without that burden." Elena moved to the counter, picking up the rolling pin. She was quiet, focused as she flattened the dough. There was a sense of understanding between them now, something unspoken but profound. They were creating something together. Not just cookies, but memories. Memories that would last longer than any inheritance or material wealth. As they finished the cookies and placed them on a tray, Margaret excused herself to her desk. It wasn't that she didn't want to be with Elena, it was that this moment was too important to rush. There were things that needed to be done, things that had to be settled. She pulled out her will, her fingers moving over the document as she carefully made a few updates. Elena, as the beneficiary of her Roth IRA, was now the sole inheritor of her legacy. Margaret had decided a long time ago that she wouldn't leave her family to battle over her estate. She would give them the chance to see what it meant to earn something, just as Elena had, just as Margaret herself had. The sound of a knock at the door broke through her thoughts. Delia stood in the doorway, her eyes soft as she took in the sight of Margaret working at her desk. "Everything in order?" Delia asked quietly, her voice filled with knowing. Margaret gave a small smile, her voice unwavering. "Everything is in place." Delia nodded, stepping forward. "You've done it, Margaret," she said softly, her gaze flicking toward the papers in Margaret's hands. "You've given them a future, and yourself a peace." Margaret looked up, meeting her longtime friend's gaze. "And now it's time for me to live," she said simply. As the evening stretched on, Margaret and Elena returned to the kitchen, where the sweet smell of cookies filled the air. It wasn't just about the dough, it was about something deeper, a moment of peace, of shared memories. And for the first time, Margaret didn't feel the weight of the past bearing down on her. She wasn't defined by what others wanted from her. She was free. And the future? Well, that was for her to shape. The soft light of late afternoon filtered through the curtains as Margaret sat at her desk, the quiet murmur of the world outside just beyond the window. Her fingers rested lightly on her phone as she stared at the message in front of her. It was from Jason, a last-ditch attempt to make amends, or perhaps just to appeal to her one final time. "Mom, I don't know what you're doing, but I need to understand. Please, can we talk?" Her thumb hovered over the screen. She thought about how many times she had read messages like this. Messages that always seemed to start with an apology, but ended with more demands, more pleas. Jason had spent so much of his life wanting her to be who he needed her to be, and no amount of explanation had ever changed that. Margaret didn't reply. She simply deleted the message. The weight of her decision, the years of trying to explain herself, trying to find a balance between her family's expectations and her own needs, had all led to this moment. It wasn't about ending ties or abandoning her son. It was about freeing herself from the suffocating obligation that had defined her life for too long. She had done enough. And now, there was nothing left to say. Her hand moved automatically to the printer, clicking the button to print out the latest ledger. The paper came out clean, neat, and as final as the decisions she had made. She reached for a hole puncher and filed it under final. The sound of the hole punch was sharp and decisive. It was as though each hole marked a clean break from the past, a past she was now free to leave behind. Margaret leaned back in her chair for a moment, her eyes flicking toward the window, where the world outside seemed to pulse with life, yet remained just beyond her reach. It was a beautiful evening, the air crisp with the first hints of fall, the kind of evening that felt like a promise of more. She stood up slowly, taking her teacup in hand, and stepped out onto the balcony. The air was cool, and she inhaled deeply, letting the breeze fill her lungs. As she looked out over the horizon, she watched as a flock of birds scattered across the sky, their wings cutting through the air in a fluid, effortless motion. It was as if they were free, free from the expectations of others, free to follow their own path. Margaret felt something shift inside her, a final, quiet sense of closure that she hadn't known she was seeking. For so long, she had carried the weight of her family's demands, their expectations, their need for her to always give more. And now, for the first time in years, she felt the lightness of letting it go. "Some people inherit cash," Margaret said quietly to herself, her voice almost a whisper as she watched the birds in the distance. "Others inherit calm." She didn't need to say it aloud to anyone else. The truth had always been there, just waiting for her to see it. Margaret had built a life not on what she could give to others, but on the peace she had finally allowed herself to claim. She wasn't leaving a fortune behind, but she was leaving something far more valuable, the chance to live without the weight of guilt, obligation, and unmet expectations. A gentle creak behind her made Margaret turn. Elena stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the warm light spilling from inside. She had been there with her, through it all. the quiet witness to the changes Margaret had made. Without a word, Elena stepped outside, joining her grandmother at the railing. They stood together in silence, the gap of generations between them bridged by something unspoken but understood. For a long while, neither of them said anything. The sky darkened slowly, and the stars began to emerge, one by one, as if in response to the calm that had settled over them both. Elena didn't need to ask. She didn't need to say anything. The quiet connection between them said everything that words never could. Finally, Elena spoke, her voice soft, but filled with meaning. "Thank you for choosing me." Margaret's heart swelled as she turned to her granddaughter. "I didn't choose you, Elena," she said, her voice steady but filled with love. "You chose yourself. I just made sure you could." The wind rustled the trees below, and Margaret watched as the last remnants of the daylight faded into night. The peace she had sought for so long was finally hers. She glanced back toward the apartment, where the life she had lived was still waiting for her to return. But tonight, for the first time, Margaret didn't feel bound to it. The future was still ahead of her, and for the first time in years, she felt the weight of it settle lightly on her shoulders. She was free. Her thoughts turned briefly to Tessa and Jason, to the unresolved bitterness that still lingered between them. But as Margaret stood there with Elena, she felt no anger, no desire for revenge. It was all behind her. The people who had once expected her to give everything were no longer a part of her world. She had built a new legacy, one not based on what she could provide, but on what she had finally given herself: the freedom to live as she chose. Margaret turned to Elena, smiling. "My DIL said she'd use my pension." That night she opened the fridge and saw the truth. Elena laughed softly, a genuine sound of warmth that filled the space between them. "I think she already knew the truth, Grandma. She just didn't want to see it." Margaret smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling with affection. "Maybe." And with that, they stood together, the world around them vast and waiting, the possibilities endless. For the first time in a long while, Margaret was no longer bound by the past. She had finally found her peace, and that, she knew, was enough.